We mentioned, I believe, last time the Book of the Dead, and went through Egypt and got to the part about the Egypt being the place where the Jews lived for 400 years and then left. I'll have a good bit more to say about that, though, in a few minutes when I come to the part on the chapter on Israel. One person I want to mention, though, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV. He is remembered as being a pharaoh who tried to convert his people to monotheism. Now, the Egyptians had been polytheistic, and why he liked monotheism so well, we don't know. But he tried to convert his people to monotheism. He failed. And that's kind of ironic because eventually all of this part of the world became monotheistic. And I will be talking more about that as time goes on. Monotheism, belief in one God, as opposed to polytheism. Belief in many gods. Now, a few historians, among them myself, a few of us believe that originally mankind was monotheistic. Then he became polytheistic, and polytheism almost completely wiped out monotheism. And if you were an alien visiting the earth around 1000 BCE and then were to come back today, you'd be surprised at how much of the modern world is monotheistic, or at least the persons who have any religion at all. Polytheism largely fell by the wayside, particularly in Western civilization. That is the area from Arabia and Iran and Iraq and west. Polytheism largely fell by the wayside. All right. Is there anything? Oh, yes. This much I want to say about dating. The old history books refer to time before Christ as BC. And then they refer to it after Christ as AD. AD comes from a couple of Latin words. BC, but today it's now BC, which means before the Common Era. You know, we try to include the whole world in it and not just Western civilization. So BC stands before the Common Era, CE stands for the Common Era. But the dates are the same in that the BCE simply means before Christ. Now, this might surprise you if you don't know already. Christ was not born in year 0. The mathematician, who was not a mathematician, who figured out the time of his birth, miscounted, and he was actually probably born more like 4 BCE. King Herod, who was still alive at the time of Christ's birth, died in 4 BCE, which means that Jesus would have had to have been born before Herod died, according to the biblical account. So he was probably born at 4 or 5, some estimates as old as 7 BCE. But anyway, your book uses the terms BCE and CE, before the Common Era and the Common Era. All right. The Egyptian religion had the concept of Ka. The nearest we have for that concept, the nearest word is soul. They pictured the Ka as shaped like a falcon. The Egyptian has had a real fascination for two animals, the falcon and the cat. And a lot of their gods show human bodies with falcon heads or human bodies with cat heads. And okay, I'll say this, but there are some people who actually believe that the ancients had mastered the technique of cross-breeding between species and knew how to mix human and animal DNA. We, believe it or not, we have been doing this ourselves for 50 years. You have to look up the right place to find it, but more like 60 years, I believe. We've combined human DNA with pig and rat DNA and come up with human and rat hybrids, human pig hybrids. You won't hear this talked about much, but it has been done in modern times. That's an unpleasant thing to talk about, so I'll leave it. Anyway, the Egyptian believed that there was a sort of ka that went in the next life, and if they could recite 10 things from the Book of the Dead that they had not done in this life, 10 bad deeds, they could expect a happy afterlife. They also wanted to carry their wealth with them, particularly the upper crust. So the pharaohs would oftentimes bury themselves with their treasure. Bury themselves with gold and silver and golden cups, and bury themselves with food. Unfortunately, a lot of their stuff was robbed. Now, what was unique about King Tut, King Tutankhamun, his was not robbed. I just call him Tut for short. And we found his tomb intact with all his treasure. And I want to remind you, your book says, and every history book you'll see will say that the pyramids were used for burial of the kings. You have to look hard to find it. You can. There's not been found one king's body in a pyramid. Where were the kings buried? They were buried quite a ways to the west of the Nile in a place called the Valley of the Kings. And I had a student in the other class who just said at first he didn't believe it, but he researched and found out, yes, what I was saying was accurate. No body has ever been found in a pyramid except for one person who was an explorer, not a king, who lost his way and couldn't find his way out going into one of the pyramids. The only human body ever found inside a pyramid. And there's no evidence that there ever was a body inside of one. All right. Now, something else. The kings, at first the kings were priests. The office of king and priest was one and the same. But as time went on, the office of priest became separate from that of king. The king had one function, the priest had another. Now this was the same way in Babylon. The early Sumerian, Babylonian, and Akkadian kings, and possibly Assyrian kings also, were all priests. And then the offices became separate. This issue of priests, by the way, is more important perhaps than you realize. Islam, for instance, has no priest. And most Protestant denominations don't have priests either. Catholic Christians have them, both Orthodox and Roman Catholic. And Islam doesn't. Generally, Protestants don't. The reason for a priest is that supposedly only the priest can go before God. So therefore, we need a priestly mediator to go between us and God. Among Islamic people, they say anyone can go to Allah, and Protestants believe in what they call the priesthood of all believers. All believers are the priest and can go directly to God without going through a mediator. All right. Okay. Moving on then from Egypt. Believe me, I'll think of a whole lot more than I could have said once I get out of here. But the Indo-Europeans. Indo-Europeans, now, if you choose to believe the flood story, and folk, I want to remind you, pyramids, flood stories, dragon stories, stories about giants, stories about dwarves and elves are found all over the world. You can believe what you will, but if you believe the flood story, Indo-Europeans were descendants from Noah's son Japheth. And when the three sons of Noah sat down to flood to divide up the world, Japheth took the north. Japheth went north. Shem took the middle and Ham took the south. But then their descendants did not remain in the places where they were divided up. But anyway, Japheth, his descendants went north for a while. We know them as the Indo-Europeans, or otherwise we know them as Caucasians. Caucasians named after the Caucasian Mountains. The Caucasian Mountains are located right here around the Caspian Sea. Between the Caspian Sea and Black Sea. In other words, it's believed that from Mount Ararat, which is located here, Japheth's descendants started out here, branched north. Now, eventually, and we're going to be talking about this in the next few chapters, chapters 2 and 4 and 5 in particular, a lot of these Indo-Europeans headed south. Some became the Romans. It's known the Romans migrated from the north. Others became the Greeks. Then you had some migrate toward the east. They became the Persians. And then farther east, they became the Aryans. The Aryans settled in India. Now, the year was approximately 1800 BCE. What made these peoples move south? A lot of persons believe it was climate change. Except for one thing, the climate change was a cooling down. Oh, no. All right, Neil Armstrong was no climatologist. He was the first man on the moon, if you remember. They're about to start showing a movie of him, of which I had a part in making. That's another story. But anyway, Neil Armstrong was a friend. They asked him one time, what do you believe about global warming? He said, well, the climate has always warmed up, and every time it warms up, it cools back down. And then once it's cooled back down, it warms up. There must have been a cooling around 1800 BCE that forced these Caucasian people south. And they went in to fill up Persia and India, Greece and Rome. Anyway, now the Caucasian peoples were also stone builders. I have a book at home that talks about 10,000 stone structures that there have always been there. Nobody knows who built them. They're structures that don't have roofs on them. The roof probably was once made of wood, and the wood has long since rotted away. And I've often wondered, what would it be like to take what's left of the stones, and put a floor on and put a roof over their head and live in them again? It would take some doing, because the stones are now crumbled and cracked, which is a problem you have with stone structures anyway. But there are 10,000 structures, and that's just like throughout our history. They've always been there. Nobody knows who built them, when. But the most famous of the stone structures is the Stonehenge. The Stonehenge is located in England. The Stonehenge is made up of some very, very large rocks. Rumor has it that the Stonehenge rocks were quarried in Ireland. Now, how did you get from, if they were quarried in Ireland, how did they get from Ireland to England? No wooden ship could carry them. And I'm not even sure that our battleship steel ships could carry them today. They're quite heavy. The Stonehenge, though, is, well, the Stonehenge is oriented in such a way that on Midsummer Day, as every June 21st, the sun shines through a circle through a hole in one of the stones, and makes a perfect circle on the ground. That way they know it's Midsummer Day, June 21st. But, now, these stones of the Stonehenge apparently have been moved. They needed to be moved because something shifted. Either the earth shifted on its axis, or the little island of England shifted. We now know, and I'll be saying this again when we come to chapter on India, we now know that the earth sits on tectonic plates. And sometime in the past, these plates have moved, and moved drastically. Maybe you've heard. Notice how that North and South America will fit snugly into Europe and Africa. This is because that North and South America once were joined to Africa. Georgia. Georgia has red clay. Cross the Atlantic straight over and go to Morocco, you find red clay. Moroccan soil is similar to Georgia. Now, these mountains up here in Scandinavia, the mountains that separate Norway and Sweden, the mountain range begins just a bit north of us right here in Georgia. The Appalachian Mountains goes up to here, and at one time when Scandinavia was joined to North America, the mountains continued on into Scandinavia. So during this time that the earth was possibly in upheaval, there might have been a split. Now the tectonic plates are still important to us because when one of them or the other one shifts, it creates an earthquake. And we have experienced quite a few earthquakes, not here in North Georgia, but around the country, around the world. There are a lot of earthquakes going on, especially around the region of Yellowstone. I'll not get into that. That's another topic entirely. But essentially then, as I said, now, number one, how did they move the rocks in the first place? Then how did they shift the rocks to where that they would always create a perfect circle on Midsummer Day? We don't know. There's been a lot of research done around Stonehenge, and Stonehenge will make news from time to time. They have found another area that's now buried, located just south of the Stonehenge, I mean just almost within sight of it, that has another big rock formation, but the rocks have completely sunk underground. That's another topic, though. But basically, though, Europeans, like the other peoples, had some kind of fascination with stones, moving stones. Indo-Europeans, now your book says they learned to farm. There's a couple of questions I'd like to ask the authors about farm animals and plants. I'll start with the animals, particularly sheep. You may or may not know, sheep are so dependent on man that they will not survive without man's continuous care. Sheep cannot find their own pastures. They cannot even find water. They have to be led to water. They have to be led to pastures. They cannot fight off their enemies. They have to depend on mankind to fight their enemies off from them. If you have, alone with one sheep, and you go around the barn, unless that sheep follows you, he'll never find you. He can't even find his way around the barn. They have to follow someone. Usually follow the biggest sheep among them, which the shepherd picks out as the lead sheep. And the lead sheep, he follows the dog, and the dog follows the shepherd. Well, how did sheep survive before they joined up with mankind? All right, now the same thing applies to plants. You may or may not be aware, now I grew up near farms and around farming people, and I have a little postage stamp garden in my backyard. Plants that produce food will seldom grow unless you have to put the seed in the ground. But before you do, you have to plow the ground, put the seed in the ground. Then you have to hoe the ground. You have to pull up the weeds or the hoeing will kill all